The room was silent except for the steady hum of machines, each one echoing the fragile rhythm of life. His hands trembled as the doctor's words sank in, words heavy enough to shatter hope. "You will no longer be able to see." In that instant, it felt as though the world itself had grown darker, as if the very light of tomorrow had been extinguished. He wasn't just losing his sight, he was losing his dreams, his independence, the colors and faces he loved most. Imagine hearing such a sentence, knowing that every sunrise you once took for granted might be the last one you'd truly behold. The weight of that reality pressed against his chest like an unbearable burden. Fear gripped him, but so did a quiet defiance. Deep within his soul, a spark flickered, an unexplainable whisper telling him that this was not the end of his story. How often do we find ourselves at the edge of despair, convinced that the final chapter has already been written? And yet, in those moments, something greater than us begins to stir. He couldn't understand it then, but he felt it, an invisible hand reaching into the darkness, planting a seed of hope where no hope should survive. It was a fragile faith, but sometimes even the smallest flame can push back against the deepest night. Every day became a battle between surrender and belief. He clung to memories of light, the glow of the sun on his face, the sparkle in his loved one's eyes, the colors of laughter that painted his world. But with each passing hour, reality tried to crush him, whispering that these things were gone forever. Still, he prayed. Not with perfect words, not with grand speeches, but with the broken cries of a man who refused to stop believing. Isn't it in those raw, desperate prayers that miracles begin to take shape? When all logic says it's over, but faith dares to say otherwise? Then came the moment that defied every human explanation. A presence filled the room, not visible, but undeniable. The heaviness lifted, replaced by a peace that words could never capture. What the doctors had declared impossible began to unravel before their very eyes. Vision, once stripped away, started to return. Colors blurred into existence, outlines sharpened, and light pierced through the darkness that had tried to claim him. He blinked, not in disbelief, but in awe. Something extraordinary was happening, something that medicine could not take credit for. This was not science, it was supernatural. His story is not just about healing, it's about hope. It's about the moments when we feel forgotten, only to realize that heaven was listening all along. It's about the reminder that no matter how final the verdict of man may sound, there is a higher voice that speaks louder. This is more than a testimony of sight restored, it's a testimony of faith rewarded, of prayers answered, of a God who still performs miracles today. And as you listen, this story invites you to ask yourself, what if the miracle you've been waiting for is closer than you think? You see, what happened that day was not just about the return of sight, it was about a divine interruption in a story that seemed already finished. You have been told before that some doors are permanently closed, that certain chapters of your life cannot be rewritten. But what if those limitations are only human opinions, not heaven's decree? What if the sentence spoken over you is not the final word, but only the stage set for something greater? That is what this story reveals. When man says impossible, God whispers, "Watch what I will do." There was no formula, no secret ritual, no human strength that could have reversed what the doctors declared. And yet, in the middle of hopelessness, faith became the key that unlocked the impossible. You have felt that same weight before, the diagnosis, the rejection, the closed opportunity that seemed beyond recovery. But this testimony stands as a reminder that what breaks you down can also become the very place where God shows His glory. The loss, the pain, the despair, they are not the conclusion, they are the preparation for a miracle. Imagine the silence after the doctor's words, the chilling stillness that followed the pronouncement of blindness. And yet, in that silence, heaven was already moving. It is often when everything around you falls quiet that God begins to speak the loudest. What if your silence, your loneliness, your darkest season is not an end but an invitation? An invitation for light to break through in ways you cannot yet see. You are not abandoned in the dark, you are being positioned for light to reveal itself. This is not simply a story to be admired from a distance, it is a prophecy over your own life. The same God who restored sight is the one who has the power to restore your vision, your future, your hope. The miracle was not meant to stay locked in one man's testimony, It was meant to echo into your life today. Can you feel it? That stirring inside you, that reminder that the impossible is not as far away as you once believed. What happened in that room is proof that heaven's power still breaks into earthly limitations. Every detail of this story carries a message directly for you. Do not accept the verdict of defeat as your truth. The doctors said it was final. The world said it was over. But God said otherwise. And today, that same voice is speaking into your situation. The miracle you thought was impossible is not beyond reach, it is closer than you think. The same way light returned to eyes that were destined for darkness, light can return to the very places in your life you thought were gone forever. The first signs came quietly, almost unnoticeable. Letters on a page seemed blurred, the faces of loved ones less distinct, the glow of a sunset dimmed as though shadows had begun to creep into his world. At first, he convinced himself it was nothing, maybe exhaustion, maybe stress. But days turned into weeks, and the darkness began to thicken, swallowing colors, stealing clarity. When the diagnosis finally came, it struck like lightning, a degenerative condition with no cure, a rapid progression that would end in complete blindness. The doctor's tone was firm, almost cold, a verdict dressed in science and certainty. There is nothing we can do, he was told. Imagine hearing those words, knowing that the gift of sight, the very window to the world, was slipping away, and there was no human hand that could stop it. Fear wrapped around his chest like chains, dragging him into despair, yet even as tears burned his eyes, something inside refused to die. He tried to hide it from others, wearing a smile to mask the storm inside, but when night fell and he was alone, the reality hit harder. Every memory of light became a wound. He thought of the sunrise he might never see again, the way his child's face lit up when they laughed, the beauty of creation that would soon be locked away in the darkness. The nights grew longer, filled with questions that had no answers. Why me? Why now? What will become of my life? But alongside the questions, a quiet cry began to rise, fragile at first, but growing stronger. It wasn't a cry of anger, but of faith. God, if you still see me, don't let this darkness consume me. It is in those prayers, whispered in the silence of pain, that heaven often begins to move. Days blurred into each other, but his prayer did not stop. And then, in one ordinary moment that became extraordinary, something shifted. He was sitting alone when a warmth enveloped him, a presence so real it brought him to his knees. It was not imagined, it was tangible, undeniable. Peace, unlike anything he had ever felt, descended over him. The fear that had been gnawing at his soul began to lose its grip. He could not explain it, but he knew, he was not alone in this battle. That moment became a turning point, the spark that lit the fire of faith. He did not yet see with his eyes, but something inside told him, sight was not lost, it was waiting to be restored. And faith, simple, childlike faith, became the anchor to which he clung. The journey was not instant, and it was not easy. There were days when the darkness seemed thicker, when doubt screamed louder than hope. But he kept declaring words of faith, even when his eyes betrayed him. I will see again. I will not live in darkness forever. He spoke it not because he felt it, but because he believed the God who creates light out of nothing could also call light back into his eyes. And slowly, he began to notice small changes, subtle glimmers that others dismissed, but that he held on to with everything in him. A faint outline here, a flicker of light there. To most, it would have meant nothing. But to him, it was the whisper of a promise being fulfilled. One evening, as he prayed, the impossible happened. He opened his eyes and what had been darkness began to shift. Shapes formed, light pierced through the blur, colors bled back into existence. He blinked, once, twice, a dozen times, as tears streamed down his face. He could see, not perfectly, not completely, but undeniably. The doctors had said it would never return, but here he was, watching light pour into his world again. He cried out, not in fear this time, but in awe, God, you are real. You have done this. It was not just sight being restored, it was his entire faith being resurrected, his hope being reborn. When he returned to the doctors, they were stunned. They examined him again and again, running test after test, searching for an explanation. But there was none. The condition had no reversal, no medical pathway for restoration. Yet here he stood, seeing, walking proof of something science could not explain. Their silence spoke louder than words. What man declared impossible, heaven had already accomplished. And in that moment, it became clear, this miracle was never meant to stay hidden. It was a testimony, a message that light can break through the deepest darkness, that God still intervenes in human stories. But the true miracle went beyond his eyes. With his sight restored, he saw the world differently, not just in colors and shapes, but in meaning. Every sunrise became a reminder of grace. Every smile, every detail of creation, carried weight it never had before. He had been blind, but now he saw, not only with his natural eyes, but with eyes of faith. Sometimes God allows us to walk through valleys so that when we step into light again, we see with clarity we never had before. The healing of his vision was the beginning of a greater vision for his life, a calling to share hope with others trapped in their own darkness. His testimony spread, reaching people who had long given up on miracles. Some were battling illnesses, others were buried under despair, others had simply stopped believing that anything good could happen again. But as they heard his story, something stirred. If God could restore sight to eyes declared forever blind, then what could he not do? And suddenly, hearts that had been hardened by disappointment began to soften. Faith that had been buried began to awaken. His miracle became the spark that lit fires of hope in countless lives. And now, this story reaches you. Not as a distant tale, not as something that happened to someone else, but as a living word, a prophetic declaration into your own life. Because the same God who stepped into his darkness is the same God who sees yours. The same hand that restored his sight is the same hand reaching for you today. You may not be battling blindness, but perhaps you are fighting another kind of darkness, fear, loss, despair, hopelessness. Whatever your valley looks like, the message remains, light is coming. The impossible is still possible. Your story is not over. This is not the end of the testimony, it is the beginning of yours. Just as his miracle was written to inspire faith, your miracle is waiting to unfold. You are not forgotten, you are not abandoned, and you are not trapped in darkness forever. The same power that restored sight is alive right now, ready to bring restoration to your life. And as you hear these words, let faith rise within you. What if today is the day your miracle begins? What if the story you thought was finished is about to be rewritten by the author of life himself? When he walked out of the clinic that day, his steps were slow, almost hesitant, not because of fear, but because he was seeing everything again for the first time. The trees looked taller. The sky looked wider. Even the cracks in the sidewalk felt like sacred ground beneath his feet. Every detail, every shadow, every flicker of light became a sermon to his soul. He paused to look at the faces of strangers, faces he hadn't truly seen in so long. And in that moment, he broke down. Not because he was weak, but because he finally understood how precious the gift of sight truly is. He lifted his eyes to heaven and whispered, "Thank you." 2 simple words, but they carried the weight of every prayer he had ever prayed. He returned home and stood at the door, unsure how to tell his family what had just happened. When his wife opened the door, he didn't speak immediately. He just looked at her. He looked into her eyes, those same eyes he once could only remember. Now, he could see them again. She froze, confused by the way he stared. Then she realized, he was seeing her. Really seeing her. Tears flooded her eyes as she whispered, "You can see me?" He nodded, unable to hold back his sobs. She ran into his arms, holding him as if she could keep the miracle from slipping away. It wasn't just his sight that was restored, it was their hope, their joy, their unity. His children ran into the room, unaware of the miracle that had just occurred. When he looked at them, he didn't just see their faces, he saw their future. He saw the joy in their smiles, the sparkle in their eyes, the life that he feared he would miss. One by one, they noticed the change. "Daddy, you can see?" one of them asked. He dropped to his knees and gathered them in his arms. "Yes, I can see," he said through tears. "And I will never take it for granted again." That living room became a place of worship that day. There were no choirs, no instruments, just a family on their knees, giving thanks for a miracle that only heaven could perform. Word began to spread, neighbors, friends, even strangers started coming to see for themselves. People who had seen him walking with assistants, guided by others, now watched him move freely, eyes wide open, face glowing with gratitude. Some came out of curiosity, others came out of disbelief, but every single person left with the same conclusion: this was not a coincidence, this was God. And in the middle of that small neighborhood, faith began to rise again. People who had stopped praying started again. People who had stopped believing began to whisper, maybe my miracle is still possible too. When the doctors called him back for a full reevaluation, they were ready to document what had happened. They ran every test, every scan, every possible explanation. But the results were the same: the damage they once documented was no longer there. The degeneration had stopped. The condition they had once labeled irreversible was now unexplainable. One of the doctors, who had delivered the original diagnosis, looked at him with wide eyes and said, "Medically, this should not be possible." And with a steady voice, he replied, "You're right. It's not possible, but it is a miracle." He asked for copies of the original diagnosis and the new test results. Not because he wanted to prove a point, but because he wanted to keep a record of what God had done. He placed the reports side by side, one filled with despair, the other filled with divine reversal. He would show them to people not to boast, but to testify. "This is where the world said it was over," he would say, pointing to the first report. "And this is where heaven stepped in," pointing to the second. These papers became his altar, a memorial stone of faith, a physical reminder that God still moves mountains. His life began to change in ways he never expected. Churches invited him to share his story. Hospitals called, asking him to speak to patients who were losing hope. He didn't come with polished speeches or rehearsed sermons, he came with tears, with truth, with a heart burning to tell the world that miracles still happen. He stood before crowds, sometimes trembling, sometimes overwhelmed, but always surrendered. And as he spoke, people wept. Not because they were sad, but because something inside them woke up. Something they thought was dead, began to breathe again. Even the way he prayed changed. Before the miracle, his prayers were desperate. After the miracle, they were full of awe. He no longer prayed just to ask, he prayed to thank. Every morning, he would open his eyes and whisper, "Thank you for light." He would walk outside and say, "Thank you for color." He would look at his children and say, "Thank you for sight." Gratitude became his daily worship. And he learned something powerful: when you live in awe, you start seeing miracles everywhere, not just in the extraordinary, but in the everyday. There were still challenges. Life didn't become perfect. Bills still came. Difficulties still knocked at the door. But now, he faced them differently. Because once you've walked through darkness and seen light return, you carry a different kind of courage. He would tell people, "I know what it's like to feel like it's over. But I also know what it's like when God steps in." His story was no longer just about what happened to his eyes, it was about what happened to his heart. His faith was deeper. His love was stronger. And his life had become a living testimony that no valley is too deep, no sentence too final, no night too dark for God to intervene. And so, every time he told his story, he ended the same way, not with a speech, but with a look. He would pause, let the silence settle, and look straight into the eyes of those listening. And in that gaze, people saw something words could never describe. They saw a man who had been blind but now could see. They saw a miracle not just in what he said, but in who he had become. And in that moment, they realized, this was not just his story. This was an invitation. And now, as this story comes to a close, I want to speak directly to you. Thank you for staying with me until the very end, for opening your heart and walking through every moment of this journey. Stories like this are not just meant to inspire for a moment, they are meant to awaken something deep inside of us. If you made it here, it means you were not just listening with your ears, but with your spirit. And I believe that was no accident. This testimony carries a message of hope, not only for one man, but for anyone who dares to believe that God can still do the impossible. And that includes you. If this story touched you, if it stirred your faith, if even for a second it reminded you that your miracle is still possible, then don't let it stay hidden inside your heart. Share it. Be the voice that carries hope into someone else's darkness. You never know whose life can be changed by hearing this testimony. Before you go, I want to thank you once more for watching, for listening, for being part of this moment. And I want to invite you to stay connected with us. Subscribe to this channel so that you never miss another story like this one, stories that breathe hope, that ignite faith, that remind you that miracles are still real. And if this message blessed you, share it with your family, with your friends, with anyone who needs to be reminded that God still moves. Because hope grows when it is shared. Faith multiplies when it is spoken. And miracles often begin with the simple act of believing together. So, thank you once again for being here. May your faith be strengthened, may your hope be renewed, and may you never forget, the same God who restored his sight is the same God who is working in your life right now. Until next time, stay encouraged, stay believing, and keep your eyes on the one who makes all things possible.